It's been 18 months we've been in this war in Ukraine. Every time we see Zelensky appears, he's asking for more funds and weapons. How these weapons and funds have been benefiting and are going to benefit Ukraine and Ukrainians, in your opinion?
Anima, it's not benefiting Ukraine. That's not the object here. Ukraine is just a pawn. The conflict is between what the U.S. policymakers consider necessary, namely weakening Russia, and that's what the whole business is all about. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians are taking the brunt of this situation. They're being asked to fight on to the last Ukrainian, and people in Washington don't seem to care very much about this fact, but it is a fact, and it's coming to an end. And people in Washington are still not ready to recognize that the so-called the end is near. And what are they going to do when it becomes completely obvious that the Russians have won the war on the ground? The Russians, of course, having always considered this an existential threat to Russia, the movement of NATO right onto its border in Ukraine, the Russian border. The U.S., well, it's quite a stretch to think that the U.S. felt any existential threat from Ukraine or even from Russia. Now, one thing that really hasn't been explored, but is so obvious to me, about a month ago, the president had his advisors around, and he said, now, look, I hear from Ukraine that they need more shells for their 155 millimeter howitzers and tanks, so let's give them some of ours. Now, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin must have had to say, oh, Mr. President, we've already given them most of ours. We'll give them some more. Well, no, actually, we're really low on those shells. Now, as you know, the decision was made to give cluster munitions for these shells, against which 111 at last count, 111 countries have ruled these as unconscionable and unlawful. So we gave them anyway. Now, that's not my point. My point is this. Why is it that this very standard, basic ammunition been around since I trained on 155 millimeter howitzers, okay? Why is it that there are none to put into the fight? Now, nobody asked that question, but I'll ask it. Why is it? Well, the answer is clear. No one expected Russia to propose any threat to Europe ever since Russia fell apart. And that was 2000, well, earlier than 2000, 2001, when Putin took over. So if there's no need to face a Russian threat from the East, what's the sense in making 155 millimeter shells? I mean, there's not much money in it anyway. I mean, it's much more lucrative to build F-35 aircraft or other things that are top dollar. Okay, that is the return on investment is really good there. So that's what the U.S. did. Now, there is no evidence that anyone in Western Europe or even the United States felt a threat from Russia in Europe. There wasn't even any rhetoric about this. Obama said, look, with respect to Ukraine, let's be careful here. Let's realize that the worst thing we can do is to give Ukraine the impression that it can win a war against Russia, much stronger Russia. Because if we give them that impression, they may try to do it. Now, Biden was vice president then. I guess he just doesn't remember. Anyhow, up until 2014, no one, not even in rhetoric, said, oh, the Russians are going to take over whatever country in Europe. So what happened in 2014? Well, as most people know, I hope, the West, mostly the US, staged a coup in Kiev, taking out a duly elected, UN supervised person elected, Yanukovych, and putting in people chosen explicitly by Victoria Nuland, who is now Deputy Secretary of State. So that was February 2014. Wow. Where was Putin? He was in Sochi, finishing up the elections. I'm talking about the 22nd of February when this coup took place. Why did Putin feel comfortable in staying in Sochi when this coup was advertised on YouTube on the 4th of February, okay? Well, when I saw that this intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador in Kiev, which showed exactly what they intended to do and who they picked to be the prime minister and all these people and all that stuff. Well, when I saw that on YouTube, a conversation not disputed by anyone, I said to myself, whoa, in intelligence parlance, that coup is blown. And poor Yatsenyuk and poor other people who were named to be the possible successors, they'll have to find some other job because the coup is blown. Guess what? I can only reason that Vladimir Putin felt the same way. I mean, why else did he stay in Sochi? And he says that he had a reassuring telephone call from President Obama saying, don't worry, everything's okay. And Vice President Biden at the same time called Yanukovych and said, everything, we worked out everything. You can go out of town. And Yanukovych, and coup happened, right? So this is Putin coming back on the 23rd of February, 2014. And he says, hey, fellas, are you all surprised as I am? Well, yeah. So what are we going to do? And the first question, of course, was, our main naval base in Sevastopol, there since the days of Catherine the Great during our revolution, that's in Ukraine, Mr. Putin. You know that. So are the Americans trying to get Ukraine into NATO and take over our only all-year-round warm weather naval base? Well, if they have that in mind, I think we have to deal with that. So what does Putin do? He says, all right, well, Crimea used to be part of Russia. What happened? And probably Lavrov, the foreign minister, explained, well, you may recall, Mr. Putin, that when Khrushchev took over from Stalin, 1953-54, Khrushchev was nowhere as powerful as Stalin, so he had to think of something to do to accrete more power. Now, I lived right on the border there of Ukraine, and he said, well, maybe this would make the Ukrainians happier if we made Crimea part of Ukraine, and I'll gain a little. So let's do it. That's what happened, Mr. President Putin. Well, how did he do that? Well, he did it like the Russians did in the old days. Says Lavrov. They took a piece of paper, right, and said, from now on, Crimea will be part of Ukraine. Signed, Nikita Khrushchev. Putin. Huh. So a new cause, huh? You mean he didn't consult anybody? No, he just did it. Well, that's not my style, says Putin. How do the people in Crimea feel about it? well, they're almost all Russian stock. In a word, they would vote to rejoin Russia proper. Well, let's have a plebiscite and see if that's true. Long story short, they scheduled a plebiscite. There were international advisors there. Over 90% of the Crimeans have said, yes, please accept us. We want to join the Russian Federation. So that's when the balloon went up. Oh, Russian aggression, Russian invasion of Crimea. Guess what, Nima? There was no Russian invasion of Crimea. There were already 20,000 Russian troops stationed there under a bilateral agreement with Ukraine to protect the naval base. What did they do? They took off their insignia. They put on uniforms that were bereft of rank and place. And these so-called polite warriors took over all the Ukrainian ministries before the Ukrainians had any word from the coup government as to what to do. Now, I'll give you a little vignette that really shows this thing up. I was, it's about 7 years ago, I was at a conference, an academic conference in Washington, and there was a woman there. She was a professor, and she was saying, I'm so proud of my son. I'm so proud of my son. And they said, why? Well, after Sunday school, he had this big placard, and it said, Putin, no more invasion or killing in Crimea. And everybody there, this whole academic group said, oh, wow, wasn't that? How old is he? 10 years old. Oh, wow. Please, said Professor, this killing and how many people killed in this Russian invasion? Oh, probably 10,000. Madam Professor, would you believe that the answer to that is 0? No, it can't be. My point here simply is these very educated professors are weaned on this propaganda out of Ukraine, distilled through US media, and all of a sudden it becomes not a peaceful takeover by Putin's ununiformed troops, but rather an invasion killing tens of thousands. So that's what we have to cope with here. Sorry to be so long-winded here, but I think people need to know that the reason there are no 155 millimeter shells for Western armament is because Russia posed no threat to anyone up until the coup against Russia in Kiev in February 2022. And well, you would think, well, wait a second now. Then certainly we thought that if Russia invaded Crimea, well, we better build a 155 millimeter shells then, right? No, they're just starting to build them. So my point is, the rhetoric went up after 2014, but the 155 millimeter shell production didn't go up. Why? Because they didn't think they had to, because they thought still the Russians would settle for this NATO encroachment toward the east. The final thing I'll say on that, of course, is that there have been all kinds of people denying. People I still respect, I like them. But, some of the most prominent ones are saying, come on. NATO enlargement had nothing to do with this war in Ukraine. Come on, well, hello. If further proof were needed, Jens Stoltenberg on the 7th of September, before the EU Parliament said, Putin was afraid that NATO would enlarge, and so he gave us a treaty saying, please don't enlarge NATO. We, of course, rejected that treaty. And now he made it clear that if we rejected the treaty, if NATO was still wanting to take in Ukraine, that there would be an invasion, there would be a war, okay? We rejected that. And instead, what did he get? He got more NATO countries. He got Finland. Maybe he's going to get Sweden. So what he wanted was no more NATO on his border, and he got still more. Ha, ha, ha. That shows the juvenile, I don't even say, well, juvenile attitude toward great power politics by a person who's been NATO Secretary General for 9 years, count them, okay, and who's just really a tool of the US, and now is going to have to be given different instructions because the Russians are serious, the Russians are winning, and the big question, of course, Nima, is what the Russians will do when the last Ukrainian is killed, and they face a situation in the West where an election year is coming up, and they can't be certain what the West will do. The West, of course, I mean the US, since the states in Europe are vassal states. And if any question of that remained, they certainly have proved it over the last few years.
Considering all this destruction that is happening to Ukraine, in your opinion, what would be the final point for the US politicians, US elites that are advocating for continuation of this war?
Well, Nima, if you agree with me, and most people do who I respect, that the name of the game is to weaken Russia in Ukraine, recall that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, about a year and a half ago now, said, look, our main aim here is to weaken Russia. Quote, we are going to move heaven and earth to weaken Russia, end quote. Oh, so that's the idea, huh? So 400,000, 500,000 Ukrainians dead? Do US policymakers care? Well, if their prime objective is to weaken Russia, then you would have to argue conclusively that they'd care. I don't think they really care. They may think that they have actually weakened Russia, which would be completely wrong. As a matter of fact, they have told the President of the United States to say, and he did say this about 6 weeks ago, quote, Russia has already lost this war. The head of the CIA has told the president, yeah, they've already lost this war, and the ineffectualness of the Russian military has been laid bare for the whole world to see. End quote. Delusional. It's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. So, well, my answer to your question is, I hate to say this, but there is precedent for letting 500,000 people die for greater U.S. strategic objectives. To what do I refer? Well, I'm thinking back when former Secretary of State and former ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, was asked by journalist Leslie Stahl about the death of more than 500,000, same figure, Iraqi children under the age of 5 because of sanctions laid on by the US to prevent Saddam Hussein from whatever, okay? So Leslie Stahl is appropriately disturbed at this figure, and she turns to Madeleine Albright and she says, but do you think that that's worth it? And Albright said, yeah, we think that's worth it. Oh my God, they don't come from the same planet, or certainly from the same religious or ethical tradition that I do, it wasn't worth it. And the killing of, well, people say maybe 400,000 Ukrainian troops, 100,000 Russian troops. They're all human beings. And in my view, it can never be described as worth it.
Mike Millich said that this is going to be a long war. We're going to continue this war. And on the part of Russians, we have Shoigu talking about this war going to last until 2025. It seems that they already know in 2025 they're going to put an end to this war in Ukraine. How do you see this contrast between these two different views?
Nima, again, you ask exactly the right question. I mean, it's sort of like this, isn't it? I mean, wow. We just learned that the Russian defense budget has been increased 70% next year. Whoa. We have people talking about a very long war. Now, the situation on the ground bears no relationship to what the prospects will be, unless, my God, unless there are other boots on the ground, and those boots would come from NATO countries, and that would mean war, open war with Russia. The top Russian leadership has already been warning, look, we're at war with the United States. The United States is at war with Russia. Let's face it. And indeed, with all the enabling technologies and weaponry that the U.S. has provided, one can at least call the United States what we used to call a co-belligerent, okay? There are a lot of things that Ukrainians couldn't possibly do without the U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and all the other things enabling, okay? So here's the situation. My prediction is that about 2 weeks from now, you'll have two things happen. The Ukrainians will have definitively lost in their so-called counteroffensive, okay? And they will have to acknowledge that. And number two, the pustitsa, what do they call it? The rains coming into Ukraine will make Ukrainian terrain pretty much impassable. And that will remain for a month, maybe more than a month, until it freezes over, and then tanks and other wheeled vehicles can negotiate the terrain. So we're going to have this period where sensible countries like Brazil, like the Vatican, like China have been calling, get together and talk, okay? Now, there is a great resistance to that on the part of Washington, because that would mean defeat. In other words, the U.S. doesn't have any high cards here. Ukraine has lost. Biden has shown a reluctance up until now to put boots on the ground, as they say when they talk about armed forces, right? Now, my friends jocularly say, well, there are already U.S. troops on the ground. They're just wearing slippers, and so they're not, when I talk about boots on the ground, they're wearing evening slippers, okay? Well, there are hundreds of those by most calculations, but this would be different. This would be U.S. troops. And the airborne troops are in Romania already. They're also in, where else? So in Poland, yeah? So here I am, Mr. Putin, looking out at what the prospects will be. Now, no one knows what Putin will do, and I suspect Putin isn't quite decided yet himself as to what he will do. So we have to talk about what his options are. Number one, with the 300,000 freshly mobilized troops late last year, who are right there, ready to work, ready to go forward, and have not yet been used in this fray, they can go straight to the Dnieper River and say, all right, this is a natural boundary. We can talk now. Are you willing to talk now? And then the West would have to react. That's one option. The other option is for him to sort of what they call attrition, right? You attrit, you attrit, you attrit, you attrit until there are thousands more young and old, some people almost as old as I am, Ukrainians dead, okay? Then what do? Well, one option would be to wait to see if any sense comes from the U.S. political situation. Now, most people realize this, but Vladimir Putin says this explicitly. He has said, and I quote, "The foreign and military policies of the United States are hostage to domestic political considerations." Now, as I quoted Obama saying 5 minutes ago, that Ukraine is not an existential threat for us. We should not give Ukraine the idea that it can defeat Russia. That's what he said, Going forward from that, what's the alternative? Well, that means that although Putin has said that he acknowledges the threat from the West, from NATO enlargement, and from missiles already in place in Romania and Poland as an existential threat, Obama admitted there is no existential threat from Ukraine or from Russia. Whoa, okay. Well, that's certainly true in a strategic sense. But is it true any longer in a political sense? One can argue that bragging that we're in this for as long as it takes, I want to give Ukraine everything it needs in order that this is a political existential threat to the U.S. leaders. What does that mean? That means a lot. It means more than meets the eye. And Nima, I'm going to tell you how I feel about this. Maybe some people will not agree, but there is ample evidence to convict not only the president and his son of bribery, some of it having to do with Ukraine as well as China, but there is enough evidence to convict Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, of interfering with the 2020 election, because that's precisely what he did. And we have the testimony of a former acting head of the CIA saying, "Oh, 3 weeks before the election in 2020, I got a call from Tony Blinken." And he said, "Oh, this Hunter Biden's laptop is a real problem. And if people find out what's in there, this could affect the election." I tell you what, Mikey, his name was Mikey Morell. Mikey, can you get some of your friends to call this a Russian disinformation exercise? And Mikey says, "Yeah, sure, I can do it." "Well, when do you need it?" 3 days from, "Oh, we can do that." Suffice it to remind people, 51, including Mikey Morell, 51 former intelligence directors and managers of all stripes, some of whom I know quite well, signed on to this thing that said, this smells like, actually the exact words were, "This has all the earmarks of a Russian disinformation intelligence operation." Okay? Now, they said that at a time when the FBI had the laptop. The FBI had the laptop for months before. And the FBI knew damn well this was no Russian disinformation intelligence operation. They went ahead and they signed the thing anyway. Was it consequential? 2 days later, in the last debate, Trump and Biden, Trump says, what about Hunter Biden's laptop, where it really reveals not only scurrilous activity, but, bribery? So what about that, Joe? And Joe Biden said, "Oh, we know that has all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence operation." Now, That's Blinken. Directly involved in that. Most people think that that probably had a substantial effect on the election results. I don't know how you can really tell, but it was 2 weeks before the election. Put that in your head, okay? How about Sullivan? Sullivan was the mastermind of Hillary Clinton's campaign, successful to an inordinate degree, to blame the Russians for everything, including hacking into the Democratic National Committee computers and relaying that information to WikiLeaks to blacken her before the election. They dreamed up that thing before the election. The FBI and the CIA cooperated in this effort, and Trump still won. Okay, so Trump still won. Now, James Comey, who was the head of the FBI at the time, and who was running this operation to make sure that Trump was defiled, connected with Russia, and that Hillary would win. He was asked one time, well, how could you play so fast and loose with the facts, with the law? Well, he wrote in his book about a year later, this is a quote: "We were operating in an environment in which Hillary Rodham Clinton was sure to be the next president of the United States, period," end quote. Okay, it's no stretch to suggest that if you're operating in that environment and you're sure your next boss is going to be Hillary Clinton, you take very small risks in violating the laws and helping her win. Matter of fact, you'll probably be appointed head of the Justice Department, or certainly keep your powerful position as head of the FBI. So that's what was going through the minds of all these people when they talked to these unlawful measures. And it wasn't just Comey; it was the head of the CIA, John Brennan. It was a whole bunch of people who were really involved in this. So anyhow, what am I saying here? The bottom line, and this is not really a diversion, the bottom line is that these same folks, do they face a politically sensitive, a politically existential threat if they lose the election? The answer to me is yes, they do. And so with this personal stake in things where they could end up in jail, for God's sake. Now, people say, oh, McGovern did. Well, let's say that Trump comes in, he's a pretty vindictive guy. Get the goods on these guys. I mean, they have to be afraid of what's going to happen to them. So all I'm saying is they have a very extra incentive, a very personal stake in this thing to prevent losing the election. And how does that relate to Ukraine? Well, they can't lose Ukraine. And how does that relate to what we face? Well, as I mentioned before, when the United States ran out of shells for 155 millimeter howitzers and artillery, they looked in the next shelf up on the cabinet and said, well, Mr. President, we have these cluster munitions that would fit those shells would fit the 155. Well, you those. What are they going to do when they run out of those? What are they going to do when the Russians show that they can produce twice as many of those? Well, the next shelf up there, oh, that one with the padlock on it. You have the key to that, Mr. President. That's the one with the mini nukes. Okay. Now, mini nukes, they're just a fraction of what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, Mr. President, we can use those to give the Russians pause and to make sure that we don't lose the election, that we don't lose our freedom if Trump wins. There's a lot hanging on this, Mr. President. Mini nukes, it's not a big problem. It's exaggerated. So we could use this. Is that likely? I hope not. But for me to entertain that as a viable option, given the stakes for these guys, I think it is one of the options they would consider. That's why I think the Russians are keep reminding people, look, we have nuclear weapons too. We can use nuclear weapons too. And if they're used, we will also use them.
Antony Blinken tweeted that 82 years ago, Nazis murdered 34,000 Jews at Babyn Yar. Soviets buried this history, which today Putin's government manipulates to provide cover for Russia's abuses in Ukraine. We know that Soviets prisoners of wars were among the people who were massacred at Babyn Yar. The Soviets liberated Babyn Yar and Kiev in 1943, and the Soviets held a trial in 1946 in Kiev for 15 German policemen involved in the Babyn Yar massacres. When you see this propaganda coming out of the US State Department and coming out of Canada, where they're going, where they're headed, in your opinion?
Nima, it's a very sad set of circumstances. I remember the Russian poet Yevtushenko wrote a very beautiful poem on Babyn Yar. It is really hard for me to understand how someone like Trudeau in Canada and all those parliamentarians would knee-jerkedly stand up and applaud a former member of the SS brigade that killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, you name it. But they did. Now, what possible advantage could they have seen in that? You know, I'm at a loss for words. I don't. So might it be ascribed simply to naivete, to a lack of any historical knowledge? You know, I mean, okay, the guy fought against the Russians. Well, so did Hitler. So did Goering. So did, you know, so these people seem to be bereft of any knowledge of what has happened over the last 84 years. Now, I happen to have lived through the entire World War II, okay? But when I talk about the war, that's the war I refer to. Now, I was very young, okay? I was born 6 days before Hitler drove his tanks into Poland, okay? But I was alive during that time. I was able to be aware, and I stood in line for a little quarters of a pound of butter, and I saw the Gold Star mothers of brothers that I knew that were killed in that war. I know a little bit about World War II, and I've lived in Germany for 5 years. When I was visited by all manner of people trying to go to the Oktoberfest and drink a lot of beer, I made sure that the last stop on any tour was Dachau, 10 miles outside of Munich. You know what happened at Dachau. So all this history seems to be lost on people who are, like most people in this world, are much younger than I am. But that's no excuse, for God's sake. The real crucible here is that every single Russian school child, boy or girl, learns this by rote, by heart. The Great Patriotic War, how Russia defeated the Nazi Germans, and what the Nazi Germans did, you know, at all manner of places, not just the concentration camps that we know about. How the Russians liberated Auschwitz, as well as Berlin, and how the Russians are never given credit for having borne the most of the burden of the war by U.S. commentaries that say, well, when we landed in Omaha Beach there in France, that was the end of the war. Well, you know, the Germans had already been defeated. You know, what's really ironic, Nima, is that we were allies. We were allies during World War II. John Kennedy, in one of his last speeches, said, almost unique in the history of the world are these two great powers that have never been at war one with the other in any meaningful sense, okay? Now, the U.S. did invade parts of Russia after the revolution, but that was quickly set back. So, never a war. More than that, we helped the Russians win the war. Let me put it that way. And I had maybe I'd be interested, I had a tangible reminder of this when I was in Moscow about, well, when was it? It was the 75th anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe, that river where Russian and U.S. forces finally met in April of 1945, just before the end of the war, okay? There are wonderful photos of that, reconstructed photos. So I was there to celebrate that. And they asked me to say a poem, which I did in Russian, a very poignant poem about mothers suffering from their sons being killed in war. And then after the ceremony was over, a Russian general approaches me. He looked real old. I learned later he was 91 years old. Name is Abramov, okay? Big Soviet uniform on, not Russian uniform. He walks right up to me, Nima, and he says, Studebaker. 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 And then he wraps me around with a great big Russian bear hug. Okay, you know, what was that all about? Well, as I hope some people know, Studebaker used to make wonderful cars in the 30s, right? And they turned their entire factories in Indiana over to the production of what we in the Army used to call deuce and a halves, okay? 2.5 ton trucks. What was distinctive about these trucks? They could go anywhere, over any terrain, pull any kind of artillery behind them, move troops. It was, Studebaker made 200,000 of these things. And how did they get to Russia? Through Iran. We had a real nice bridge there. So what Abramov was saying to me is, thank you for your Dusseldorf, for your 2.5 ton trucks made by Studebaker, okay? And I was touched because, that was it. Through Lend-Lease, we gave the Russians the wherewithal to move this heavy equipment, to beat the Germans at Kursk and the great tank battle and in other places. And so it shortened the war. In my view, the Russians would have won anyway. But that's disputed, and that's just my opinion. In my opinion, it would have taken 1 or 2 years longer, but then the Russians would have ended up in Lisbon and on the Atlantic coast of France. But be that as it may, we helped. We were allies. There is no reason on God's earth where we couldn't be allies again instead of threatening each other with extinction to the rest of the world.
German parliament decided is giving a green light to sending Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine just to hit the Russian soil. It seems that the history is repeating itself.
Germany is a vassal state of the United States. Now, one would say that's very odd, given the fact that the Germans are among the most civilized, cultivated, smart, well endowed with natural resources country in the world. But this is nothing new. If you go back, 90 years to 1933, the Germans were facing rather difficult challenges. And when Hitler bubbled to the top and staged the Reichstagsbrand, the burning of the German parliament, blamed it on the communists, and got more and more support, he got support from the Social Democrats. Hitler initially in 1933, I think they had something like 30%, 40% of the vote in parliament. All of a sudden, the Social Democrats, the Catholic Party, Centrum Party, they all caved because they were afraid, okay? When Hitler started going after the Jews, nobody spoke up. Why? Because they were afraid. Did the religious authorities speak up? No. Why? Because they were afraid. Okay. Now, what does this mean? There was a young law student. Actually, he was already practicing law. He was studying to be a judge. He was in Berlin at this specific time, and wrote a diary. His name is Sebastian Hafner. That was his pen name. His real name was Raimund Pretzel. And he is rather frank indictment of how the Germans caved because he was there, okay? He watched it. He experienced it. And he accused them of sheepish submissiveness. He said that lacking was a kernel of courage that comes to the fore in extreme times. It was lacking in the Germans. Now, it's foolish to indict a whole people for the sins of their rulers. And I do not. I mean, 5 years in Germany, I love Germans, and I have some still really good friends in Germany. But there is this syndrome where they're sheepishly submissive. Sebastian Hafner mentioned that as soon as the Reichstagsbrand took place, there were no more newspapers from the left-hand side, from the left people on the newsstands. And he commented that when people's desks were inspected illegally, or people were marginalized from their jobs, everyone said, well, we got to be afraid of these leftists and these communists that burned down the Reichstag, So it was sheepish submissiveness. Now, if you need further proof of this, take the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, the Germans know that the U.S. did this. The U.S. advertised it in advance and then gloated about it after the fact. Cy Hirsch, as most people know, or should know, has the chapter and verse on all this. And the Germans, a lot of the German people know this. Matter of fact, there has been a gain in power on the part of the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, okay? They've grown in power to be the second most powerful party in Germany. This is the hard right people, okay? Why? Because they're criticizing the German government for being pussycats, for being sheepishly submissive, okay? Now, I won't go through chapter and verse, although maybe I should just remind people of key episodes here. In February of 2021, Olaf Scholz, relatively newly elected as Chancellor of Germany, stood at the next podium to Joe Biden. And Joe Biden was talking about Nord Stream. And he said, if the Russians invade Ukraine, this is February 7th, if memory serves, 2021. If the Russians invade Ukraine, there will be no more Nord Stream pipeline. Okay. Now, a very courageous Reuters woman correspondent said, "But now, Mr. President, how can you say that? Because you don't control the Nord Stream pipeline. Germany does," pointing at Olaf Scholz. And Biden says, "Trust me, there will be no more Nord Stream pipeline. We can do that. Now, here's Olaf Scholz standing 10 feet away from the president. She turns to him, to her great credit, and she says, Herr Kanzler, was halten Sie davon? Mr. Chancellor, what do you think of that? and Olaf Scholz is sort of like the proverbial deer in the headlights, and he says, he reverts to the, to the default situation. He says, well, I will say, we do everything together. Anything important we do together. There's nothing important that the United States and Germany doesn't do that we do together. Okay, now talk about sheepish submissiveness. Have German parliamentarians had the courage to ask their Kanzler, Herr Kanzler, did Joe Biden tell you he was going to blow up that pipeline so essential to us? Did he tell you that then? Or did he tell you that in September when it was blown up? What did you know, Herr Kanzler? And when did you know it? They won't even ask him. Sheepish submissiveness. Now, Cy Hirsch, who came out with the original story, has pointed out that, even the Nord Stream pipeline had very little to do with Ukraine. It had to do with preventing Russian influence growing in Europe. I mean, after all, when you're dependent on Russian gas and oil to the degree that the Europeans were, well, your rivals don't like that, and they do everything to squash it. So that was the name of the game here. It was on the books for a long time. Lots of people wanted to prevent this pipeline. And I have one new nugget to share with you, Nima. Be the first to hear it. I learned about 2 weeks ago that Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, when he was up studying in Harvard, for his dissertation to get out of college, to get his bachelor's degree, he wrote a dissertation, which he later turned into a book. And what would you think the name of this dissertation is?
Ally versus ally.
Well, you're up on these things. So McGovern.
Show me the book.
There it is.
Yeah.
You see it?
Yeah. That's
okay.
it.
So McGovern hears about this. He said, my God, I wonder if I can get a hold of that book. I checked on Amazon, and you know what they wanted? They wanted $90 for it, $90 US. And I said to myself, for the general cause, Ray, go ahead. I paid $90 and I got it in 3 days. What did I do? Well, I knew that, like Professor Hill, what's her first name? Fiona Hill, and other Russophobes, that Tony Blinken trained or was educated by arch Russophobe Richard Pipes at Harvard. I escaped Pipes. I decided not to go to Harvard for graduate school. And I thank God to this day that I was not brainwashed like they were. Anyhow, what I did was I immediately looked up in the index, and thank God there's a really good index. It's only 200 pages, this book, but the index is good. And who did I look for? I looked for Richard Pipes. Okay. And there were 3 wonderful allusions to Richard Pipes, but I'm just going to cite one for lack of time here. Blinken is talking now in the mid-'80s, when they were trying masterfully to prevent Siberian oil from coming down into us, other pipelines predating the Nord Stream pipeline. And he talks about how confident Ronald Reagan was. He says, Ronald Reagan was convinced that the Europeans could be persuaded to follow America's lead. Wow. Richard Pipes This is a quote from Tony Blinken's dissertation. Richard Pipes, former National Security Advisor for Soviet Affairs, put it frankly, quote, "We see no reason in continually deferring, as has been done in the past, continually deferring to the Europeans. We always humor the Europeans. They never humor us. Enough is enough." Period. End quote. Oh. So this is the mid-'80s. Here's Tony Blinken, having put this out now as a book, pretty much disposed to saying, "Oh, this is a terrible, terrible thing to let the Russians give all this gas at cheap prices to Western Europe. They're going to take over Western Europe because Richard Pipes told me so." And what happens? After the pipeline is blown up, who gets up and gloats about it? Tony Blinken. He says, what a masterful thing to make sure that the Russians can never dominate economically the rest of Europe. So, it's not a stretch. It's not a stretch to think that in addition to Tony Blinken and Jacob Sullivan, that there was a lot of feeling here. All of these people having been trained at the knee of Richard Pipes of Harvard, that the Russians had to be prevented. Now, the other thing here is really, I'll add this because it's really important. Okay, the pipelines were not really working only because they were shut off, okay? There was already natural gas in those pipelines. All that had to happen is you pull a lever, right? It was getting cold in September of 2021. There were German negotiators up in Moscow talking about ways to turn that pipeline back on. Only sensible approach, right? For God's sake. Why don't we find some way to appease the Americans and turn the pipeline on so we don't freeze to death, and so our industry doesn't go kaput, which is the German word, okay? Now, we knew that is, United States policymakers knew that. The Germans always tell us, oh, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. So we knew that was happening. So the only way to prevent this from actually becoming a cause célèbre in Germany before it gets cold, we blow it up on the 26th of September. That's what we did. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is that there is this fable going around that it almost sounds like a joke, Nima. It sounds, 5 Ukrainian sailors and 1 doctor will walk into a bar. No, walk into a sailboat, right? A sailboat, and they did it, right? Give me a break. Anyone, well, you and I know that's rubbish. But here's a little vignette. Only take a second. I'm Irish and I have skin cancer periodically. I have to have it peeled off by a surgeon, a dermatologist, and he knows me real well. And he reads my website, raymcgovern.com, and so he comes in this time about a month ago, and he says, "So, Mr. McGovern, so it was the Ukrainians that blew up that pipeline, huh?" And without thinking, I said, "That's BS." I used the full word, Then I realized, oops, you usually don't say that to a doctor who's about to peel off strips of your skin. So I didn't mean BS. I just meant that's a story that's going around. It doesn't hold weight. Now, why do I mention that? This guy is really smart. He's not only a doctor, he reads my website. That means he's really smart, right? And still, he fell for this fable because MSNBC said it, that it was the Ukrainians that did it. So this is really important stuff. And Cy Hirsch, to his great credit, is pursuing it. He's got good sources, and hopefully he'll find some way to get his stuff off his Substack and out into the real world in time to affect people's thinking before the election that comes up, because there cannot be any more important election than the one coming up in the United States in just a little bit more than a year now.
Ray, how do you find this war in the case of miscalculation on the part of the US? They were thinking that with those troops trained and equipped by NATO and with all tremendous sanctions imposed on Russian economy, they're gonna bring Russia to its knees. But it didn't happen. Do you think it was an intelligence failure, or they decided to go along with this plan and even at the expense of Ukrainians, even considering the destruction and devastation of Ukraine and Ukrainians?
Both. If you look at the people who are running our foreign policy, they're arrogant. They think they're exceptional. They think they're indispensable. I mean, not only Richard Pipes, but the rest of the people up there in Harvard gave them the idea that they could pretty much work their will wherever they want to apply it. Matter of fact, when you look at the grand schools that these people come out of, and the idea of exceptionalism that has been ingrained into them, they are the same stock as what author David Happerstrom called the best and the brightest that got us into Vietnam. I remember the callous references to whether bare brown feet prancing through the jungle could beat U.S. forces in Vietnam. Well, they did, okay. And who was it that was responsible for that? The dean of Harvard College, McGeorge Bundy, Walt Rostow from MIT, the Bundy brothers, the whole smear of them, highly educated, including Dean Rusk, who was a Rhodes Scholar. I'll tell you something else about Rhodes Scholars later. But, all these people thought that the U.S. could prevail. And those of us who saw that the French experience itself just a decade earlier indicated that the U.S. could not prevail. Those of us who told our betters, our policymakers, that look, after the war, the famous Free French General Leclerc was sent out to Indochina with the mission of saying, can we get back Indochina, and what would it take? He reported back, the answer, gentlemen, is no. We cannot get it back, and we could put 500,000 troops in there, and still we would not win. Okay, that's 1946. The French tried, and they did not win. But the US came in and said, of course, we're the US, of course we can win. And we resorted to all kinds of extra-legal lies to justify the fight. I refer specifically to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, when North Vietnamese patrol boats were provoked by secret U.S. Navy ships and did fire on them, almost hit one of them, didn't hit the other one. That was used, okay, to justify in a legal sense what LBJ wanted to do. Now, what I want to say is the day after, and we knew that there was no firing on the second day, on August 4th, okay? We knew that's what the situation was. Now, so did McGeorge Bundy, former dean of Harvard College, okay? So he's the national security advisor. he admitted on what used to be Huntley Brinkley, it used to be an NPR show, a really good talk show in the evening. He was asked, now, Mac Bundy, what happened the next day when you knew there was no real fracas that day, and the president comes in? What did he say to you? And Bundy says, well, he said, okay, Mac, we got him now. Are you going to go up to the Hill and sell him that resolution now? And I said, well, Mr. President, he's a really tall guy, you know. Now, Mr. President, it's not at all clear what happened. Just so what did the president say? The president looked down at me and he said, Mac, are you going to go up on the Hill and sell that resolution, or are you not? What'd you say? I went up and I sold the resolution. Now, how do these people feel entitled to lie about war? I'll tell you one other thing, which is just as devastating every mark. On October 27 last year, the Valdai conference invited President Putin to make a presentation. Typically, he spoke for 25 minutes and then stood for 3.5 more hours to answer questions and answer Q&A. About toward the end, he got this question, which really didn't seem to be a canned question, but here it was. Mr. President Putin, what do you think of the United States policymakers taking on China at the same time as they're taking us on in Ukraine? I mean, what do you make of that? And Putin sort of strokes his chin and says, you know, I thought there might be some subtle reasoning behind that, but I no longer think so. I think it's crazy. I think it has to be attributed to arrogance and a feeling of impunity, period, end quote. Now, I happen to agree with President Putin on that, but it doesn't matter what McGovern thinks or believes. It matters what Putin thinks or believes. And if he thinks we're crazy, not we, but our policymakers are crazy, and if he thinks they have a personal stake in not losing the election and not losing the war, my God, how much on the alert does he have to be to untoward events that people so arrogant and so much feeling a sense of impunity might do? That's why I consider, and I think I've explained this before, I've been around a while. You learn a lot in a while, and sometimes you live long enough to share it. I've been watching Russia for over a half century, okay? Never have I been so scared that the nuclear genie will be let out of the bottle, and that my 10 grandchildren and my family, that me for the rest of my days, won't have the rest of my days because of miscalculations, because of accidents. Let me adduce one more thing here. I mentioned that I was born 6 days before World War II started, okay? Now, there was another fellow who was born 6 days after World War II started. And his name is Stanislav Petrov. Who was he? He was a lieutenant colonel in the Russian army who exactly 40 years ago, that is 1983, came on duty at the Soviet surveillance thing there outside of Moscow that looked at radars and other indications of what the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile situation in the United States was. My God, 5 minutes after he's arrived, there are 5 ICBMs flying toward Moscow. The alert goes off. He's on the phone with them. We're just trying to see. We're trying to find out where the sun. He held people off. He said, "We're going to wait. We're going to wait, see what." And then he remembered, whoops, these computers are not all that reliable. They taught me that at school. Oh, whoops, let's wait for the radar. And also they taught me that if there's going to be an ICBM attack, it's not going to be just 5. So, okay, I'm going to take a chance. I'll wait. He waited long past the time when the Russians would have had time to retaliate, okay? Luckily, as he said, I just called it the way I saw it. I took a risk. Luckily, they were just reflections off the sun or something, some radar glitch or radar error, okay? So, why am I saying that? Well, number one, I feel a certain affinity to Stanislav Petrov, because he was born 12 days after I was. I mean, it's a good Yargan, a good a good year, a good month, a good week. But more than that, I asked myself, if I were at age 44, faced with that kind of decision in current circumstances, would I have had the guts to act as responsibly as Petrov? I wish I could say, oh, sure I would have, but I can't say that. I don't know how I would react. Now, is there a chance of miscalculation now? Well, much more chance than back in 83, when things were bad enough, mind you, in 83. And are there people, human people, like men and women in the chain of command that make these decisions? Well, I pray to God that there are, but with automatic intelligence and everything else, who knows? So we are at a very delicate stage in our cosmic history here. And we can't always depend on people like Petrov to do the right thing, the more so since tensions are even higher now than they were in 83. And the communication between Russians and Americans are even less, virtually non-existent, than they were in 1983. I was briefing the President's Daily Brief in 1983. So I know a little bit about whereof I speak, and I know what kind of people were advising Ronald Reagan. And it was hardcore warriors like Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, Weinberger, the head of the Defense Department, but also, thankfully, George Shultz, head of the State Department. And he was the one that was able to talk sensibly to Reagan and finally bring Reagan around to realize that Gorbachev was the real deal. They could deal with him, and they could actually conclude an agreement that did not just limit, but destroyed a whole class of nuclear-tipped missiles already installed in emplacements in Russia, European part of Russia, and in Europe. In Europe, they were the Pershing II missiles. In Russia, they were the SS-20s. Now, when Gorbachev suggested that, I said, wow, that's great. That ain't never going to happen. Never in history have you destroyed a whole class of medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles. But in those days, it was doverai no proverai, trust but verify. The verification regime that was put in to verify the destruction of these missiles was so elaborate and intense that it worked because there was a measure of goodwill on both sides. My good friend Scott Ritter was one of the inspectors that went way up north to Votkinsk, where some of these things were actually constructed, were produced, and he was one of the people that made this thing work. So, doverai, no proverai, trust but verify. Problem today is there's very little trust. With a modicum of trust, we could overcome these difficulties, but with the political situation in Washington, I'm on tenterhooks for the next year and a half.
Recently, the US State Department was saying that Putin is seeking the glory of Russian Empire. Do we have any evidence to support such a claim?
Oh, that's a good question, and I can answer that very briefly. No, there is no such evidence. As I said before, even the West acknowledged that because they didn't produce the rudimentary shells of 155 millimeter warheads to put on their missiles. So there's all kinds of evidence. Look at the rhetorical record. Russia was not seen as an implacable enemy from the mid-90s until when did I say before? 2014, when NATO did the coup in Kiev, and things went sharply downhill. I should mention one other thing. After the coup in Kiev, and after the accession of Crimea into Russia, there was a lot of trouble in the other parts of Russian-speaking Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, in what's called the Donbas. Now, they didn't want to live under the coup regime any more than the Crimeans did. And people don't know this, but it's on the public record. They pleaded with Putin, please take us into Russia. We want to be part of Russia. I mean, Lugansk, Donetsk, we're all Russian speakers. How come you take Crimea and not us, please? And Putin said, no. Why? Well, there were hostilities going on. John Brennan, the head of the CIA, appeared in Kiev in early April of 2014 and gave the word. The word clearly was, go ahead and clean out those people in the eastern Ukraine. We'll support you. Send your army out there now. And the Ukrainians did. An army heavily populated by Azov-type fighters, namely neo-Nazis, okay? They started shelling the Donbas, shelling Donetsk and Lugansk. And finally, it got so bad that everyone realized, well, we ought to have some sort of a ceasefire. Long story short, they met twice, in 2014 in Minsk, Belarus, and then 2015, Minsk II in Belarus. And they decided, look, we will change, and the people deciding this, were Germany, France, Ukraine, and representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk, okay? And they decided there would be a ceasefire in return for a solemn promise to give Lugansk and Donetsk a degree of autonomy under a new constitution to be written for the Kiev regime. Now, those negotiations started at the beginning of 2015. They kept not being successful. They couldn't get. There was no acknowledgement by the Ukrainians that they needed to change their constitution to give these people some autonomy. And as a matter of fact, the shelling went up, and it went up, and it went up. Okay. Now, at the end of February 2022, the shelling went up in a drastic proportion. There were 50 shellings on the 12th of February, 1,400 on the 16th, going up to 1,500 on the 17th and 18th. Mind you, it was on the 24th that the Russian troops went into Donbas. So what does it tell you? Well, it tells you that as Putin has explicitly admitted, he should have gone in there when he was asked to by Donetsk and Lugansk. He said on the 21st of February, it was a much delayed move, but I've decided to accede to Lugansk and Donetsk and help them in this fray. So what's the supreme indignity that I would point to in this calculus? It is the following. In December of 2022, Angela Merkel, who was Chancellor of Germany, and well, she first broke the news. She said, look, Minsk? Oh, that wasn't a serious thing. That was just a stratagem to give Ukraine time to build up its armed forces. And look where they are now. Now they're fine after 7 years. Ha, 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 ha. Francois Hollande said the same thing just a month or two later. And so did Poroshenko, who was the representative of Ukraine at the same time. So, and Zelensky has since said it. So they're gloating. They say, we diddled the Russians thinking that we were negotiating in full faith and in pure faith. Look what happened. The Ukrainian army is now ready to fight. Now, when I say that was the supreme indignity, I mean, put yourself in Putin's place. Here are his Russian stock people pleading with him, please save us, help us. With UN statistics, 14,000 people of Russian-speaking people were killed by the shelling in Donbas between the coup and the beginning of the special military operation, 4,000 or 5,000 since then. So you're approaching 20,000 Russians being killed. That's a lot. Now, believe it or not, I think Putin feels very strongly about his countrymen who were, by accidents of history, left outside Russia when the Soviet Union fell apart. He feels pretty strongly about his need to do what he can to help them. He didn't do it. He refused to do it. 2014, 2015. Finally, he decides to do it. And he admits to those who have been trying to persuade him to do it that, yeah, okay, this is too late, but I'm not going to be diddled again. And so trust is at a premium. Trust has pretty much evaporated. And no matter what the West might propose now in terms of negotiations, if on the outside chance they ever do, the Russians are going to be very, very careful. They've won the battle on the ground. They're not going to sacrifice any of their wins to some illusory promise by the West to do or not to do something in exchange.